I'm Nick Van Ortes. I'm the director of the Center for International Science and Technology Policy, the unit of the ELLIOTT School of International Affairs that is co-organizing this event together with the University of Ottawa, and my colleague that you will see, Professor Linton, is here from Canada. He will address you in a few moments. My job is very short, very simple here. I want to thank our guests, our speaker, John Holdren, the Vice President of the University, the Vice President for Research, Leo Chalupa, Bill Bonvillian from MIT, and all the other guests in the room. Just to say a couple of words and call Leo to open up the event. This is an event that has run for several years now. Some of you have seen it actually here and in Ottawa because it alternates. 1 year is in Washington, the next year is in Ottawa, so next year it will be there. It happens once a year about this time of the year, and until now we've had a very positive response. If you remember 2 years ago, the presentation was given by the predecessor of John, another John Marburger, who talked about science or science policy. The way will happen today is as follows. We will have a few short introductions following with Leo Chalupa, the Vice President for Research for GW. Then Jonathan Linton will come up to address you from the University of Ottawa. Bill Bonvillian has graciously accepted to say a few private memories from Allan Bromley, and finally introduce our speaker, John Holdren. So Leo Chalupa is the Vice President for Research of this university. He is the first person to hold that position. It's a new position, was created 2 or 3 years ago, 2 years ago, I believe. Leo himself is a very distinguished researcher, has a long history of very productive research in the field of neurobiology. He came to us from the University of California at Davis. So please, Leo.
I want to make just 2 points, really. One is that I think everybody in this room knows that the George Washington University has considerable strength in public policy. We're here in the ELLIOTT School, in my unbiased judgment, the best public policy place in the country. And we have several institutes ready on the books that are very productive. So, for example, the Center for International Science and Technology Policy, which Professor Van Ortes heads. We have the Cybersecurity Policy and Research Institute, which Professor Lance Hoffman heads. And we have the Space Policy Institute, headed by Scott Pace. And now on the books, we have a new initiative in science policy, where a group of about 15 faculty have worked for a number of weeks and provided a proposal for how we can achieve preeminence in the general field of science policy. And we are now, as happened with other initiatives that come from my office, have set up an external committee to come actually in June and spend 3 days reviewing the proposal. And I'm happy to announce that just before I started speaking, William Bonvillian agreed to chair this committee. So we're going to get a sterling group reviewing this, and I would hope that depending on how the external review goes, the next year we'll be searching for a director of the new Institute for Science Policy, in which I am determined that the university will put in sufficient funds so we can achieve preeminence in that field. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is that I want to express my thanks to our guest, John Holdren. I think everybody here is aware that President Obama's initial budget had what I think was a remarkably healthy request for an increase for the NSF, for the NIH, and for other scientific endeavors. And even with the negotiations where draconian cuts are proposed for many, many areas, the budget for science has remained relatively robust with fairly minor cuts so far, and let's hope that continues. And so it's been the work that Dr. Holdren has done in the White House that I think as a proponent for science that has maintained us in the spotlight and maintained the kind of funding that this country needs, not just to do science, but I really believe it's in the national security to maintain the scientific endeavor. So that's all I'm going to say. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now that we've been through 2 sound checks, I feel very comfortable being up here. My name's Jonathan Linton. I'm here as the co-host of the Bromley Memorial Lecture and a representative from the University of Ottawa. This lecture was started a number of years ago by Professor Venordis and Professor de la Motte at the University of Ottawa. Unfortunately, Professor de la Motte passed away a few years ago, and I've done my best to try and live up to the high standards that he set for not only the lecture, but for cooperation in this area between our great institutes in the 2 national capitals. And like many things between Canada and the United States, this is an example of excellent cooperation offering mutual benefits. Along with me are a contingent of 11 Canadians, including the director, my colleague, Professor Mark Sanner of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy at the University of Ottawa. And I look forward very much to hearing the lecture and the events that will continue for the next 2 days for our group on science, technology, policy, along with our colleagues and friends at George Washington University. I'd like to now take the opportunity to introduce Dr. Bill Bonvillian, and he's an excellent person to take over for me as he goes well back with Dr. Bromley and would like to share some thoughts and memories of Dr. Bromley with you, and then introduce our speaker, Dr. John Holdren. Last thing I would like to mention about Bill is that he has, for those of you who don't know him well, he has years and years in DC working on federal energy and science policy, so a long distinguished history, and he's putting that history and that expertise to good use of the Director of Programs and Operations for MIT for all of their activities in Washington, D.C. So I'd like to hand things over to Bill and look forward to the talk. Thank you.
So my friend Nick Venordis, I teach on his adjunct faculty, so I know how I got the assignment, asked me to say a few words about Allan Bromley, and as well as to introduce John Holdren. It's very special for me to be able to do this. Allan and John are 2 of the most successful presidential science advisors in recent times, so I'm honored to be able to speak about both of them. First, a few words about Allan Bromley. His background. Allan, of course, was Canadian by birth, and he was born in Westmeath, Ontario. Studied at Queen's University, got his PhD in physics from Rochester, taught there, then worked for the Atomic Energy of Canada as both a senior researcher and a section head, and then went to Yale as a professor. And he founded and ran the Wright Nuclear Structure Lab there. Then he became chairman of the physics department in 1972. He is really considered the father of heavy ion science, and he made pioneering contributions in the area of atomic nuclei. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Science in 1988 for this work. So from 1989 to 1993, he then moved to OSTP as President Bush's science advisor. Among many initiatives, he battled for science funding increases, successfully, I might add, in light of the manufacturing and technology challenges that the U.S. then faced. He also supported work on high-speed internet and a host of other fields that were evolving at the time. I got to know Dr. Bromley. The Allan part came later. When I was working on Capitol Hill, there's a rule on Capitol Hill. If two principals have a meeting and there are no staff present, the meeting did not occur. So I was used to make sure the meeting occurred by being the present staff. And Allan, impressed me from the outset. Most scientists, when they visit Congress, they look like they're accompanying Dante to the Inferno. They're so uncomfortable, and you just know what's happening. I mean, the scientists understand the scientific method, and they have to deal with these political junkies. If there's two fields that are less comparable, those are the fields. And you can just see them thinking, this is the 7th layer of hell, and then the next meeting, this is the 6th layer of hell. But Allan was different, and in his kind of endless bow ties, which he always sported, and his blue pinstripe suits, he just had such a jaunty spirit to him. He didn't belong in hell, but he was obviously delighted to be in hell, and he liked hell, and we liked him. It was another period of the collapse of U.S. manufacturing. Sound familiar? But Allan, unlike many, frankly, in his administration, actually talked about how the U.S. faced profound competitive challenges and thought and worked on how to deal with those. In his OSTP role, he took very important steps, very important to science, to elevate the role of the science advisor, to which we are in his debt for. He had cabinet rank as the president's advisor for science and technology. He attended cabinet meetings. He attended the daily White House senior staff meetings. Those are signals of authority in Washington. John, of course, shares those. Although the Presidential Science Advisory System was disbanded in 1972, Dr. Bromley persuaded President Bush, the first President Bush, to reactivate. He established PCAST with very prominent scientists and industry leaders, and he really used those meetings to get advice, and that group met with the president on a number of occasions. Historically, really, for the first time since Vannevar Bush and Roosevelt and Killian and Eisenhower and Jerry Wiesner and Kennedy, science was sort of right in the door of the president again. He was the first to issue a joint guidance memo with the director of OMB regarding administration priorities for science and technology budgets. He made the fix-it system, the interagency committee structure, work by insisting that the agency heads or their deputies be represented on these committees and that OMB be there as well, which meant there was real authority in those committees. He saw climate change as an issue, and the U.S. Global Change Research Program obviously has been quite successful over time, and it began with leadership from OMB and OSTP under Dr. Bromley. He was the first director of OSTP to have an assistant director for social sciences. One of his initiatives was the establishment of the International Science Mega Project. His concept there was that the U.S. should develop these projects up front with other countries, not deliver them wholly formed and ask for funding later. And in light of the cost of many science fields, of big science, that step has been an important one. So many of Dr. Bromley's OSTP best practices remain key cornerstones for OSTP today. I got to know him especially when he returned to be Dean of Engineering at Yale. Yale's president, Rick Levin, was a growth economist and saw the importance of science, and he asked Allan to lead a revival of physical science and engineering at Yale. And Yale's renewed strength in these fields is in significant part testimony to the groundwork that Allan laid before his death in 2005. So I'll close with one of my favorite Bromley-isms before I introduce John. Planning a trip with European science leaders, his OSTP staff was going crazy. How were they going to find a hotel in Paris that would fit with the government per diem travel allowance? Alas, Allan wanted to stay at his favorite hotel, the George V. His staff countered with, Dr. Bromley, there's so many small, charming hotels on the left bank. dripping with irony, Allan came back with a motto for us all. I'm not into charm, I'm into comfort. His staff was very fond of him. Now, it's a special privilege to turn to John Holdren, advisor to the President for Science and Technology, director of OSTP, co-chair of PCAST. John was Heinz Professor of Environmental Policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard before coming to the White House. He directed the Science Technology Public Policy Program at the Belfer Center there, and he was director of Woods Hole. Born not far from Pittsburgh, raised in San Mateo, California, he studied aeronautics, astronomics, plasma physics with an SP from MIT and a PhD from Berkeley. Stanford, John. He taught at Harvard for 13 years and taught at Berkeley for over 2 decades. His work has focused on the causes and consequences of global environmental change, on energy technologies and policies, and early before that, on ways to reduce the danger from nuclear weapons and materials. He has been a pioneer in the expanding field of science and technology policy throughout his career. He has advised President Obama on what was the largest increase in R&D funding in 2009 since Sputnik, and on the remarkable expansion of energy R&D, and he has led in trying to persuade the nation to confront the climate challenge. You know, we now face a different era in science funding, but despite adamant calls for cutbacks this year, the FY 2011 funding for science was remarkably steady, and we have John and his strong and thoughtful relationship with the President to thank for that. There are many things in the works at his very activist, very busy OSTP. The nation finally has a strategy for American innovation with ongoing updates. There is a major position on scientific integrity that's been issued. We have a global science diplomacy effort. Major initiatives have begun in STEM education in cooperation with industry. And PCAST has many projects pending, maybe the most activist PCAST I've ever seen, including on the future of manufacturing and strengthening the research university. So we have an OSTP under John with a truly big picture and the ear of the President. Let me turn to John now for the Bromley Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
And where is the advance for the slides? Here we go. Well, thank you very much. For those very kind remarks. And don't worry about the Berkeley-Stanford mix-up. I love them both. And I love Harvard as well. And I love George Washington University and the University of Ottawa for that matter. Oh, can't forget MIT, where I did my first 2 degrees. I'm going to cover a lot of ground here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Allan Bromley and his predecessors and his intellectual heirs. I'm going to talk about the scope and the roles and the challenges in the science and technology policy process generically, and then I'm going to turn to the title of these remarks, the official title, and talk about the challenges and opportunities in the Obama administration, what we're doing about them, what we propose to continue to do about them, and what the particular challenges are that we face going ahead. Bill has already said a lot about Allan Bromley, so I don't have to say so much. He was a remarkable individual. All of the things listed here and more. I had the pleasure of knowing him, although not as well, I'm sure, as Bill Von Billion did, but certainly I learned from him. And among the things I learned from him was quite a lot about how to be an effective science advisor to the President of the United States. He was a superb mentor in all of the fields in which he excelled himself, and his mentees are all around the country and all around the world serving in important roles in science and technology and in public policy. He was a role model for all of us. I had the great good fortune to learn from a number of other giants in the study and practice of science and technology policy. None of us ever figured out how to make a microphone stand up. Those included George Kistiakowsky, who was the second science advisor to President Eisenhower. He was the first presidential science advisor that I met. I met him in 1973 at a Pugwash conference. And that was probably the moment in my life when I started aspiring to be the science advisor to the President of the United States. I admit that somewhat sheepishly, but my early acquaintance with George Kistiakowsky, who was a professor of chemistry at Harvard, a fantastic individual and another extremely effective science advisor, made me start thinking that if I was extremely lucky and in the right place at the right time and did everything else right, I might possibly someday aspire to be a science advisor to a president. Harrison Brown, another one of my early mentors, remarkable character, Foreign Secretary of the National Academy of Sciences already in his 30s. He was really the guiding genius behind the founding of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, a pioneering international interdisciplinary center of research and analysis on major problems of the human condition. Harvey Brooks, certainly one of the fathers of science and technology policy as a discipline, the founder of the program on science, technology, and public policy at Harvard that I had the great honor of leading following Harvey once removed with Louis Branscombe in between. Joe Rotblatt, one of the founding fathers of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, a tremendous figure in science and public policy globally, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995, which he shared with the Pugwash Conferences. Jerry Wiesner was President Kennedy's science advisor and then President Johnson's, and was a dear and close friend of mine and another mentor from whom I learned an enormous amount about many things, including, again, about how to be a science advisor to the President of the United States. There are other giants in this field that are fortunately still with us that I learned a lot from. Dick Garwin, who was a member of the President's Science Advisory Committee to at least 3 presidents and remains today in his 80s a consultant to OSTP of enormous value to us. Frank Kress, science advisor to President Carter. Jack Gibbons and Neil Lane, the 2 science advisors to President Clinton. Jack Gibbons in the first term, Neil Lane in the second. Both very close friends of mine, with whom I worked as a member of PCAST in the Clinton administration. And again, I learned a great deal from working with them and watching them operate in this environment. Paul Doty, an amazing individual, the founder of the Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, and also one of the founding fathers of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, who helped get me into that international science and technology policy milieu at a relatively early age. I want to talk about that domain a little bit, and the domain has really 2 dimensions, 2 sides to a coin, as Harvey Brooks always described it. One is science and technology for policy, meaning, as indicated here, the analysis and advice for policymakers and for the public, that we are able to produce about the science and technology dimensions of all of the policy issues with which our political leaders and our publics are or ought to be concerned. And the other side of the coin is policy for science and technology. And that relates, as indicated here, to the analysis and the advice and the recommendations we provide on R&D budgets and related policies, on science and technology education, science and technology workforce issues, infrastructure, scientific integrity issues, and policies. And there's a ... there to indicate that there are other dimensions, some of which I'll talk about. And of course, a cross-cutting focus that cuts across those 2 dimensions, science and technology for policy and policy for science and technology, is the study of the mechanisms and the processes by which all of this gets done and how to improve the effectiveness of those mechanisms and processes. And I know a lot of people in the program here at GWU, a lot of the people in this room, are preoccupied with exactly that. How does this really work, and how do we make it work better? There are a variety of roles for both natural and social scientists in the science, technology, and policy domain. I've listed some of them here. Research and analysis on both of those dimensions, including the assessment and improvement of the processes by which those things happen. Communication of the findings to colleagues, to policymakers, to the public, through all these different vehicles, reports, articles, books, op-eds, blogs, interviews, lectures, briefings. Communication is enormously important in the business of science and technology policy. Indeed, it's absolutely essential. And typically the people who are the most successful in this domain are not only the people who have devoted a lot of time and effort to understanding what they need to know about the substance, but people who have learned how to communicate that substance to policymakers and to the public. Of course, teaching and training of students and colleagues to enable or to improve their performance in those kinds of roles. And that's, again, one of the things that's going on in the program here and its counterpart program in Ottawa. And science and technology education activities aimed at improving the general science and technology literacy of decision makers and the public as a basis for more informed engagement with this set of issues. Some people, of course, do all of these things. Some focus on a subset. All of those different distributions of effort are important and respectable, and I'm sure the students in this room will find themselves distributed across various combinations of these kinds of activities. I want to talk about some generic challenges of process as it relates to the policy environment. One has to do, as I've already implied, with educating and energizing the public. We've got to figure out how to do more to overcome the generally low level of understanding in the public of science and technology. And in doing that, we need to figure out how to make the relevant insights accessible to a wide audience without oversimplifying. This is really one of the great challenges in science and technology policy communication. How can you keep it simple enough to be understood by a very wide audience and at the same time not make it wrong? Enormous challenge there. And another great challenge is, very frankly, how do we rebut nonsense in a soundbite culture? There's a lot of nonsense out there. And what I often say is somebody can tell a lie in one sentence that takes 3 paragraphs to rebut. And in the soundbite culture, you might not get the 3 paragraphs. So how do you deal with that? How do we get better at rebutting the nonsense that's out there in this very demanding situation that so much has to be conveyed in soundbites? Another big challenge, of course, a set of challenges, are the challenges of teaching and training in science and technology policy in colleges and universities. Relatively few colleges and universities have gotten really good at this. This is one of them, I'm happy to say. But doing that requires, first of all, overcoming a deeply ingrained academic prejudice against interdisciplinary pursuits. There remains a conviction out there among some people that interdisciplinary pursuits are the last refuge of people who couldn't hack it in a discipline. This is not correct. Interdisciplinary work is at least as challenging as disciplinary work. Requires, in some sense, a different set of skills, a different set of capabilities, a different kind of training, but it is no less rigorous, no less demanding, no less challenging than disciplinary work. A second big challenge, of course, is maintaining funding for science, technology, and policy efforts in academia under the kinds of budget constraints that everybody is facing. There is, again, a tendency to sort of fall back on the traditional disciplinary department, saying, well, we're going to do that. If something has to go, it's going to be the interdisciplinary efforts. We have to resist and fight that. But something that is not a problem, I have found in my experience, and I ran an interdisciplinary graduate program at Berkeley for 23 years before going to Harvard for 13, never had a problem finding appropriate posts for our science, technology, and policy trained students and postdocs. There was and remains enormous demand for the people who can actually do this, who can integrate the natural science and social science dimensions of these issues and make it intelligible and make it applicable, implementable. Talk about a few challenges of process in the policy environment in terms of doing what I and my colleagues at OSTP are doing today, what I call internal advising for national governments. That is, as opposed to trying to get your views in front of the government from outside, how does it work when you're on the inside? What are the challenges in working in science and technology for policy and policy for science and technology inside the government? One of the huge challenges there is allocating budget resources among competing needs. There is no formula for doing this, no cookbook that tells you how to deal with this particular challenge. The budget is never enough. The competing needs are always compelling. Enormous challenge in our day-to-day work is dealing with that. And Kei Koizumi, sitting there in the second row, who I know teaches here as well as working as my Assistant Director for Federal Research and Development at OSTP, is struggling with this every day and helping me struggle with it every day. How do we do this allocation job? Another big challenge is how you reconcile, or if you can't reconcile, at least tolerate, the diverse agency perspectives on questions like transparency and openness, on questions like the proper role of scientists, including government scientists, in public communication, and so on. Different agencies have different roles, they have different views, they have different cultures, and somehow we have to make them all appear to be perhaps more seamless than they are in their approaches to these matters. Another big challenge that preoccupies a lot of our time is fomenting and coordinating interagency initiatives. The Office of Science and Technology Policy has the responsibility for everything interagency relating to science and technology. Any science and technology initiative, venture, activity that requires the participation of more than one cabinet department, agency, office is under our oversight. And that's a huge challenge. It's often like herding cats to get folks to work together in an effective and mutually supportive way. On the science and technology for policy side, the other side of that coin, one challenge is coming to grips with the reality that the facts from the science and technology side are never everything in the policy process. I used to tell my students at the Kennedy School, which of course is a policy school, and I'm trying to teach them science and technology for policy. First thing I would say to them is the science and technology facts are not everything, but they are usually something. It helps if you begin from a place when you're thinking about policy in a particular domain of understanding the basics of the relevant science and technology. If you try to form policy without that, you're almost certainly not going to get it right. Although again, the science and technology are never going to be the whole story. They're going to be economic issues, political issues, values issues. That's why we have politics, in fact, is to deal with competing values and the tensions and the trade-offs between different dimensions of these complicated issues we face. Second big challenge, day to day, is cultivating cooperative relations with the other advisors. I'm the science and technology advisor. I got to work with the economic advisor. I got to work with the national security advisor. I got to work with the domestic policy advisor. And in fact, it was Allan Bromley, perhaps more than anybody else, who told me how important it was to cultivate those relationships with your colleagues who are advising the president with stature equal to yours. They're all assistants to the president for something. Assistant to the president for domestic policy, assistant to the president for national security, assistant to the president for homeland security. You've got to develop good working relationships with those folks or you're sunk. You're going to spend all your time fighting with them for turf and access if you don't have good relations with them. And finally, absolutely crucial, is using the time and attention of the principal wisely. My principal is the President of the United States. And if I don't use his time wisely, if I impose on his time for matters that could and should be resolved at a lower level, I'm soon going to lose the degree of access and trust that I have. This is absolutely crucial. Whoever your principal is, whether you're working for a president, a secretary, an undersecretary, an assistant secretary, an agency head, use the time and attention of that person carefully. Do what you can to get things done without rushing every time there's an issue to the principal. Let me turn now to the science and technology linked challenges and opportunities specific to this administration. Some of them, of course, many of them were shared with prior administrations, but these are some of the ones with which we're preoccupied now. The President, looking at this in an overarching way, first of all, when he spoke to the annual meeting of the National Academy of Sciences in April of 2009, becoming, by the way, the first president since JFK to go over to the National Academy following his inauguration and talk to the annual meeting. And I found that particularly wonderful because JFK had gone to the National Academy accompanied by my mentor, Jerry Wiesner, and I got to go to the National Academy with President Obama, where he gave this remarkable speech about his views about science and technology in the context of the crises and challenges of our time. And he said this much-quoted statement that science is more essential for our prosperity, our security, our health, our environment, and our quality of life than it's ever been before. Talk about two sets of challenges linked to science, technology, and innovation, both domestic and global. The domestic ones, and you could all make your own list, probably would have some similarity to this one, but you might have some other items. Economic recovery and growth obviously has to be very high on the list. Science and technology and innovation are enormously important there as drivers of recovery and growth. Some of the kinds of tech that are going to be germane are infotech, biotech, nanotech, green tech, other techs probably not yet discovered or even thought of. Healthcare. The aim there is better outcomes for everybody at lower cost. That's a huge challenge. Science and technology have an enormous role to play there. The energy and climate challenge, which I see and the President sees as tightly intertwined. We need cleaner and safer energy supply, including not just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but reducing oil imports, environmental impacts of a variety of other kinds along the way. There's a whole set of other resource and environmental issues that are increasingly coming to the fore. Water, which many people call the next energy in terms of the set of problems that water availability and quality are going to cause around the world. Land use, coastal zones, toxic substances, biodiversity, and sustainability. How do we manage all of those things? National and homeland security, another domain rich with challenges and opportunities for science, technology, and innovation. I've mentioned some here. How to better detect and disarm improvised explosive devices. Cyber and power grid security, biodefense, how we ensure the safety and reliability of a shrinking U.S. nuclear stockpile without nuclear testing. And in the global domain, again, health, preventable and pandemic disease, enormous set of challenges there. Development, how do we eradicate poverty and provide the possibility of sustainable prosperity for everybody. Energy and climate. This is not just a problem for the United States, not just a problem for China. The problem, the challenge is to provide for societies everywhere the energy their economies need without wrecking the climate that their environments need. Land and water. We are witnessing an intensifying competition for the world's land and fresh water, competition among the principal human uses for those crucial resources, among the production of food, fiber, fuel, the provision of land and water for infrastructure and industry, and of course for ecosystem function. We have to leave something left over of our land and water for the ecosystems on which we still depend for the cycling of most of our nutrients, for the production and maintenance of the fertility of the soil, for the natural cleansing of the atmosphere and surface waters, for the maintenance of habitat for biodiversity, which is really a library of genetic information from which new drugs, new foods, new vaccines will come. The oceans, their ecological integrity and productivity, absolutely essential to the future prosperity of human society. And finally, weapons of mass destruction. Again, how do we ensure that we can avoid the use of nuclear and biological weapons anywhere in the world? I want to say a few words about how President Obama views this rather daunting set of challenges. The first thing he thinks about them is that they are interdisciplinary and they are interconnected. And in fact, there's probably no better example than that than the intertwined challenges of energy, economy, environment, and security, which are intimately entwined in a great many different ways, and of course, extremely interdisciplinary. You have to understand engineering, economics, physics, chemistry, biology, climatology, and politics to even begin to comprehend the nature of that problem or to sort it out. The second major insight in President Obama's views about these challenges is that science and technology are not just relevant to success, they're central to success. We're not going to get there without a greater set of contributions from science and technology. And that centrality means putting science and technology in the center of what the federal government thinks and says and does about these challenges. It means, as the President said in his inaugural address, putting science in its rightful place. And in fact, we talked about this in my job interview. I went to Chicago in December of 2008 to meet with the President at his request to talk about this job. And he talked about this in that interview, about science in its rightful place. I mean, one of the interesting things is these insights that I'm going through are not things that I had to explain to President Obama. President Obama started with this set of insights about what we were dealing with. Don't know where he got them, in the sense that he doesn't have a science education, doesn't have a science background, but what this president understands about science and technology and how and why they matter is simply extraordinary, simply extraordinary. Fourth insight is that success in these challenges requires not only applying science and technology to the specific challenges as we perceive them, but it also requires nurturing the cross-cutting foundations of strength in science and technology, and I'll say more in a minute about what those are. And finally, that interdisciplinary and interconnected character means that solutions require partnerships across federal agencies, across the branches and levels of government. There's the legislative branch, the executive branch, federal, state, local requires partnerships among public, private, and philanthropic sectors, and it requires partnerships among nations. It's interesting, at the very first meeting that President Obama had with his cabinet, one of the first things he said was about cooperation and partnerships. He said, our challenges are too big and our resources are too limited for us to be able to afford non-cooperation. I need all of you to cooperate with each other, and I need all of you to build partnerships with the private sector, with the philanthropic sector, across the branches of government. We need to work together. He's famous for saying about some of these challenges, we need all hands on deck. And he also said, and we need everybody holding hands while they're all on deck if we're going to get these problems solved. Let me talk a little more about some of these propositions. The centrality of science and technology, what do we need? And I'm not going to read these to you. I'll just go through the list. You can read faster than I can talk. A set of things in the way of the kinds of innovation we need for the economy. A set of things that we need for this health challenge. How do we get better outcomes for all Americans at lower cost? We get it not only with better health technology per se, but better use of information technology. It will be enormously important there. Energy, a whole set of things we need, perhaps starting with better batteries and cheaper photovoltaic cells, but it's a much longer list. And again, in all these cases, there's a dot, dot, dot there. You can add your own ingredients to these lists. Agriculture, a lot of things that we need in agriculture. We have been, I think, relatively speaking, neglecting agricultural research in relation to its relative importance in the scale of challenges that we need to work with in this country and around the world going forward. And climate change, of course, an enormous set of challenges where science and technology and innovation have enormous contributions to make. National and homeland security as well. I've already suggested some of the things we need there. And again, I think all of you could make an even longer list. But it is clear when you contemplate this at this time that we need an enormous and diverse set of contributions from science and technology if we are to meet this array of challenges. Let me turn to the cross-cutting foundations of strength in science and technology. I start with the institutions that do most of the basic research in this country. Our great research universities, our national laboratories, nonprofit research centers, enormously important. We have to nurture them, we have to nourish them, we have to support them because they are crucial across all of the domains of specific applied challenges that we face. They're part of our infrastructure, but there are other key parts of our infrastructure for science and technology. Information technology and broadband, high-speed computing, energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, space technology. A lot of people think about space as the great adventure, looking outward, understanding the universe, exploring. It is all of those things, but it's also a very important and crucial set of kinds of infrastructure, communications infrastructure, global positioning, Earth observation. It is part of our scientific infrastructure that we cannot afford to neglect. Science, technology, engineering, and math education, which increasingly is referred to as STEM education, not referring to stem cells, but to science, technology, engineering, and math. The president has often said that the single most important thing he thinks we need to do for the future of our country is to lift the level of our game in STEM education. I'll talk a little more about that by and by. And finally, the fourth set of cross-cutting foundations are the economic and policy conditions that are conducive to entrepreneurship, to innovation, and to forming successful partnerships. And those include intellectual property rights, access to financing, tax policies like the research and experimentation tax credit, export policy, immigration policy, which affects how much easy interchange and how much cooperation we can have in science and technology with other countries. Transparency and predictability in regulation, also obviously important. Let me turn then, having described the challenges in this way, to what this administration has done and is doing to meet the challenges and exploit the opportunities that we face. And I start with what the president did to put science in its rightful place, as he called for in his inaugural speech, and I start with the appointments he made. This president has appointed 5 Nobel laureates in science to presidentially appointed positions. That's never happened before in the history of the Republic, and I list the 5 here. He has appointed more than 25 other members, beyond those Nobel laureates, of the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, Institute of Medicine, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, to presidentially appointed positions, including the heads of the NIH, NOAA, USGS, the Food and Drug Administration, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, more than 25 altogether. There have never been that many members of our science and engineering and medicine academies in presidential positions. We have a CTO, a Chief Technology Officer, and a Chief Information Officer for the first time in history in the White House. And we have an engineer, by the way, running EPA. Lisa Jackson, as some of you may not know, is a chemical engineer by training. Science, technology, and innovation have never been as prominent in leadership positions in our federal government. Putting science in its rightful place in speeches and events. The President has highlighted science, technology, and innovation in an enormous number of speeches. He did it throughout the campaign, in his inaugural address, in his State of the Union addresses, in the address I mentioned at the National Academy of Sciences, in a whole variety of speeches. I could fill pages with the number of speeches in which the President has stressed and emphasized the key importance of science, technology, and innovation in addressing the challenges our society faces. White House events. The number of times the President uses the podium and the platform and the venue of the Oval Office to highlight science and technology by bringing into the Oval Office National Middle School and High School Science and Math winners, National Medal of Science and National Medals of Technology and Innovation winners, groups of U.S. astronauts. This is actually out of date. It's now 9 occasions. I apologize for not updating the slide. An earlier version snuck into this, to this presentation. U.S. Nobel Prize winners, Math and Science Teaching and Mentoring Award winners. The President has Math and Science Teaching Awards, Mentoring Awards in Math and Science, Presidential Early Career Awards in Science and Engineering, that is the PKs. Prior presidents often didn't meet with those folks, or if they did, they just rushed in for a photo opportunity and rushed out again. I've never seen this president do that. His scheduler will say, this is just a photo op. And then the president will come into the room and he'll start chatting up the group and they'll talk to him and they'll stay there for 15 or 20 minutes, driving his scheduler nuts. But it reflects the president's genuine personal interest and engagement with science, technology, STEM education, the importance of what these young, mid-career, and older scientists, technologists, and innovators are achieving and how important it is. And he tells them that. No president has ever talked as much about science, technology, and innovation as this president has. A picture of him with middle school mathletes. These are middle school winners of a national mathematics competition in the Oval Office, just illustrative of it. I sometimes note that I think we in OSTP have probably the best batting average in the White House in terms of the fraction of events we propose that the president accepts. And the reason is we propose all these events that bring particularly young scientists and engineers and mathematicians into the White House. The president always says yes to that because he loves it. He said to me after one of these events, I wish I could spend more time with scientists and science students and less time with sports teams. He does like sports, but he likes science more. Bill already mentioned in introducing the extraordinary level of activity of this President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, his PCAS. I just list here the number of PCAS studies already requested by the President and completed. And again, you can read this faster than I can read it aloud. So just take a look at not just the number, but the breadth of the studies that this President has requested from his PCAS. PCAS is co-chaired by me and by Eric Lander, who is the distinguished mathematician and genomicist, who is the director of the MIT Harvard Broad Institute on Genomics. We have 2 vice chairs, Maxine Savitz, who's the vice president of the National Academy of Engineering, Bill Press, former deputy director of Los Alamos, former Harvard professor, now professor at Texas in 3 or 4 different disciplines, and 16 other members that come from industry, from NGOs, from academia, amazingly diverse and capable group, and the President is calling on that group all the time to do studies. These are studies underway with PCAS as we speak, and that's not all. Again, this slide is slightly outdated. In fact, Bill Bonvillian mentioned one about the health of the research universities, which I didn't even get onto this slide in my haste. In fact, I was going to mention earlier, in relation to that haste, after I said that I kind of aspired someday maybe be the science advisor to the President of the United States, that as I was testifying for 3 hours today before the House Appropriations Subcommittee that controls my budget and much of the rest of the science and technology budget, as it was going into the third hour, I was thinking, you really have to be careful what you wish for. But we are doing a lot. This is the president meeting with his PCAS in one of the rooms of the East Wing of the White House, 3 Nobel laureates in the picture. Harold Varma sitting across from the president expostulating at the moment. And I'm not falling asleep, I'm looking at my notes. If you must know. These, in terms of science in its rightful place, are recommendations of PCAS studies that have already been implemented. That is, we're not just getting studies that the president asks for to him. He is paying attention and he is directing that the recommendations be implemented. The recommendation to prepare 100,000 new highly qualified K through 12 STEM teachers by the end of the decade. Launching a new advanced research projects agency for education. We already having launched one for energy, ARPA-E, this is ARPA-Ed. Initiating improvements to influenza vaccine manufacturing to shorten the production time frame. Expanding the ARPA-E domain and adding new energy innovation hubs which link national laboratories, universities, and corporations to get discovery from the laboratory into the marketplace. Accelerating the adoption of electronic health records. Supporting research to foster the next revolution in information technology. These are all recommendations by PCAS studies that the president has taken. I like this particular picture. The president not only listens to what PCAS says and reads what it writes, but he enjoys it, as you can see here. And that's the Nobel laureate in chemistry, Mario Molina, who's visible there right behind him, and Shirley Ann Jackson, another PCAS member, former director of former chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in theoretical physics, I think in this country, but also from MIT, member of PCAS. Of course, in the end, people say if you want to know what's really happening, follow the money. Say a few words, therefore, about budgets. Those were also mentioned very kindly by Bill Van Buren. I thank you for that as well, Bill. Investments. Science got a huge boost, as Bill did mention, in the stimulus and recovery package. The FY 2009 and 10 budgets and the recovery package together added up to the highest federal research spending ever and the biggest boost, as he points out, in research spending since the space race. The Total Recovery Act funds for science and technology, including not just R&D, but information technology and transportation, infrastructure, applied energy technology, space exploration, over $100 billion in the recovery act for science and technology. And the president, in that speech at the Academy that I've already mentioned in the spring of 2009, announced some new investment goals. He announced the goal of doubling the budgets of the basic science agencies, the most important basic science agencies, NSF, DOE, Office of Science, and the National Institutes of Standards and Technology Laboratories, double the budgets of those entities in the space of 10 years. He proposed to make the research and experimentation tax credit permanent to encourage more research and development in the private sector. And he proposed that we should aim to lift the sum of public and private investment in research and development to greater than or equal to 3% of GDP. It's never been there. At the height of the space race, we made it to 2.9% of the, of course, much smaller GDP at the time. Today it's about 2.8%. We want to get to 3 and beyond in spite of the budget constraints, the fiscal constraints that we face in today's economic environment. Bill also mentioned that we did better than most in the 2011 Appropriations Act that was passed only in the middle of last month. And this shows the 2010 appropriated levels for a number of the major science agencies, and then the 2011 budget that was just finally passed after a continuing resolution, which left us at the 2010 levels and left us with some of the constraints that the appropriations language in 2010 had applied. And again, this is not great news. This is not where we wanted to be. The budgets that the president proposed for 2011 were significantly higher than this in virtually every category. But compared to, again, as Bill said, the draconian cuts in many of the other categories, we did pretty well in science in this 2011 budget. And the president has proposed for 2012 a continuation of robust increases. This is what I was testifying about today before the relevant congressional committee. We want the Congress to work with us to observe the president's priorities. We're going to have to cut a lot of stuff. We're going to have to do a lot to try harder to balance the budget, to reduce the deficit. But the president has said repeatedly, I don't want to cut innovation. I don't want to cut education. I don't want to cut infrastructure. And these budget recommendations that he put forward in the 2012 budget in February reflect very substantial increases in most of the science categories. This is the picture provided to me by Kei Koizumi. He used to do this for the AAAS. His successor now does it for the AAAS, but he gets the numbers from Kei. Kei denies it. Anyway, it's a very instructive picture. It shows in constant FY 2011 dollars the picture from 1995 to 2012. We had increases through here that resulted in part from the studies that we did in the Clinton administration PCAP, recommending ramping up of research and development in the second term. That ramp up continued into the early part of the Bush administration, then it leveled off, came back down, then he had a big boost in the Recovery Act there, you see, in 2009. 2011, we didn't even quite hold the line, but we didn't go down as much as many other things did, and then this is the 2012 proposal, trying to restore that upward trajectory. Bill also mentioned, he gave half my speech, actually. He just did it more briefly than I'm doing it. He mentioned that we have an American innovation strategy that has a number of ingredients, investing in the building blocks of innovation, most of which I've already mentioned. Promoting market-based innovation. Again, I've mentioned most of the elements of that already, so I won't go through it. The strategy also includes catalyzing breakthroughs for national priorities where basically public goods are involved, where you can't expect the private sector to do all that is required. And that includes clean energy, accelerating biotech, nanotech, and advanced manufacturing to improve our competitive position to create sustainable, high-quality jobs, develop advances in space applications, breakthroughs in healthcare technology, and a leap forward in educational technologies. And finally, again, some cross-cutting issues. All of these efforts include increased support for early career scientists and engineers, increased support for commercializing university research, increased support for multidisciplinary and high-risk, high-return research, and increased support for partnerships across sectors. I'm doing terribly on time here. I'm going to get going. Working with the private sector, what most people don't realize is that firms today are funding 2/3 of U.S. research and development and performing more than 70% of it. So we can't just do this job in the federal government. We have to work with and encourage the private sector, making the research and experimentation tax credit permanent is part of that. Recovery Act has helped start and grow clean energy businesses across the country. Small Business Innovation Research Initiative is providing lots of funding for many different avenues of innovation. The Small Business Lending Bill signed last September increases loans and cuts tax rates for entrepreneurs. And of course, I've mentioned the DOE's Energy Innovation Hubs already. This is the president visiting GE in Schenectady in January of this year, looking into a big turbine. We launched just at the end of January a new initiative called Startup America to bolster entrepreneurship, having successful entrepreneurs mentor aspiring entrepreneurs and get a higher success rate in high-growth startup. Let me move right along. NASA and human spaceflight. We inherited a space program that was in disarray after years of mismatch between the vision and the budget that were supplied. The Augustine Committee, which we stood up to look at the human space exploration program, the Constellation program, deemed that program for crewed missions beyond low Earth orbit to be unexecutable. That meant no matter how much money we pour at it now, we cannot meet the original goals of the program. It's over budget, behind schedule, underperforming. We had to fix it. And meanwhile, in NASA, Earth science, space science, and aeronautics had all been gutted to feed the Constellation program to try to narrow that gap. There wasn't enough money to narrow the gap, but it was enough to harm all these other programs. The International Space Station was going to be scrapped in 2016 after putting $100 billion in it. It was going to be flown into the Indian Ocean in order to save money to pay for a rocket whose principal purpose was to carry astronauts to the International Space Station. This is one of the aspects in which the program was dysfunctional. And the projected gap in our ability to transport U.S. astronauts to low Earth orbit on U.S. rockets after the retirement of the space shuttle was in fact lengthening. We developed with great effort a plan to reduce the discrepancies to reduce the gaps, to rebalance NASA's programs with longer use of the International Space Station to 2020 or longer, more science in the program, more R&D on advanced systems, more diverse destinations for crewed missions, and increased reliance on commercial transport of crew to low Earth orbit to free up NASA to focus its advanced and unique resources on the more demanding missions beyond low Earth orbit. We rolled that plan out with the President's 2011 budget. He elaborated it in a speech just a little over a year ago at the Kennedy Space Center. And this is the President on that visit to the Kennedy Space Center visiting one of the private efforts. SpaceX Falcon 9 was subsequently launched successfully. And in fact, I'll say a word about that in a minute. The NASA Authorization Act of 2010 was a compromise. It had much that the President and NASA wanted, but it also reflected the congressional desire to use existing technologies and contracts to develop a new heavy lift rocket by the end of 2016. It's going to be very challenging to do that. Sometimes the Congress believes that they put something in legislation, it will definitely happen. That is not necessarily true. You can't legislate necessarily the laws of physics or some of the ironclad laws of engineering development. But in any case, that's the goal, and we're going to try to meet it. The President's 2012 budget funds all of the elements of that act. The omens for commercial crew are improving. Two recent successful launches of the SpaceX Falcon 9, and one of the Constellation Prime contractors is now in the competition for commercial crew. That's a good thing. Energy and environment, lots of initiatives. I just put them up here and let you speed read this list of things the administration has done in the energy and environment domain. It's really extraordinary. In 2012, we've got $550 million for ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy. Energy efficiency and renewable energy is up 43% in the 2012 budget from the 2010 appropriation. We want to double the number of energy hubs, mentioned that already. We're making climate change mitigation and adaptation a priority for initiatives in departments and agencies employing their existing authorities. We didn't get the bill we wanted through Congress last year to do this through congressional action, but we're going to do what we can with existing authorities, and in the meanwhile, we're going to work with the Congress on initiatives to accelerate the transition to cleaner and more efficient energy options that bring multiple benefits. You don't have to make the argument for new energy technologies just on the basis of climate change. It brings economic benefits, other environmental benefits, and security benefits. And of course, we're going to continue to work with other major emitting countries to build technology cooperation and individual and joint climate policies that make sense. National Oceans Policy, again, I'm not going to read this to you, but in July 2010, we had a new National Oceans Policy setting up a National Oceans Council to run an interagency effort with all kinds of new priorities and goals. This is the President signing the bill, flanked by me and Nancy Sutley, the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality, with whom I co-chair the National Oceans Council. STEM education, enormous set of initiatives in STEM education, including initiatives based on partnerships. We have in the Educate Innovate program $700 million and more of private sector and philanthropic support for improving K through 12 education, in large part by bringing role models, mentors, and helpers from the national labs, the universities, and corporations, scientists, mathematicians, and engineers into the classroom to work with the teachers on improving curriculum, improving the hands-on activities available to the kids, and serving as living examples of what exciting careers are available in this domain. This is President at the White House Science Fair in October of last year. Bunch of initiatives and principles and procedures. I just list some of them here. Stem cell guidelines, streamlined reporting procedures for federal grants, scientific integrity principles, open government, new databases available in every agency in the open government, and more partnerships in the international domain. We've been reviving and strengthening our high-level Joint Commission meetings on science and technology cooperation with the 6 countries where we have those ministerial level agreements, nurturing the strong cooperation that has long existed with the EU, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, multilateral economic forum, U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogue, U.S.-Russia Presidential Commission, all have very strong science, technology, and innovation focuses. We've been streamlining the visa procedures that apply to visiting scientists and technologists. Science, technology, and innovation are the centerpiece of the new USAID development strategy, and of course the Cairo speech in June of 2009, developing the concept of science envoys and centers of excellence around the world. We've got two sets now of science envoys going to different countries across the developing world. You see them pictured here in the countries they visited. It's been a remarkably successful and welcome effort around the world. We've had reviews in which we gathered the science envoys to talk about what they've learned. A lot has come out of that. We're sponsoring a conference on it this spring to figure out better how to move forward. There are lots more challenges ahead. How do we sustain support for science and technology under the budget cuts? Some of the particularly demanding issues, things that will be challenging to sustain in this budget environment are listed here. Virtually in every agency, there are things that are going to be targeted for one reason or another. Either they're big and expensive, or in the case of the last category, many members of Congress don't like international cooperation. They don't understand why it makes sense, so that's always a target. Challenges, of course, in getting the key messages across. I've mentioned that already. The challenge of advancing a coherent climate policy, energy and climate integrated. The challenge of implementing public interest information technology initiatives, health IT, government efficiency and openness, public safety, and of course, the systemic weaknesses in STEM education, which we have to remedy if we are to move this country smartly into the rest of this century. The linchpin of progress in these domains really is a knowledgeable and committed president, and we fortunately have one. Thank you very much. I'll take a few questions. I probably consumed most of the time that was intended for that, but please.
Dr. Holdren, the American Peace Act, the reauthorization of NSF, puts a heavy emphasis on commercialization, technology transfer, as does the list of PSA studies on board.
Do you sense a shift either in the Congress or the administration away from basic research, more toward the short-term economic
Not at all. I
gains?
think this is not an either or, but a both and. In fact, if you read the President's speech to the Academy in April of 2009, I'd say 60% of that speech is about the relevance and the importance of basic research. The President is absolutely convinced that when it comes to these cross-cutting foundations, STEM education and basic research are absolutely crucial. We will continue to try to support those. If you look at the budgets proposed for 2012 or the budgets we got for 2011, the agencies that did the best were NSF, the ELLIOT Office of Science, NIST, the NIST laboratories. Sorry about that, the NIST laboratories. We remain very strongly committed to basic research, but we think in addition, we need to get better at transferring discovery out of the laboratory, out of the universities, out of the national labs, and into the marketplace.
John, you briefly mentioned S&T awareness in the public. It's a very pernicious and widespread problem.
It's not easy to solve through government initiatives, it seems, but you had it as a bullet, but I was wondering if you could speak to how that can be changed, because it's a generational thing, and how do we raise the awareness or education?
In the long term, you do it through lifting your game in STEM education, because STEM education is not just about trying to educate and train the Nobel laureates and National Medal of Science winners for the future. It's also about training a technology-savvy workforce that we're going to need in the century we're now in, and it's about educating a science-savvy citizenry who are better positioned to function as citizens and voters in a democracy where more and more of the issues have science and technology in them. But that's the long-term answer. That takes a long time. We're going to do it. We're making the investments, but we also have to find better ways to lift the level of awareness and understanding in the short run. And one of the ways we're trying to do that is send more of the federal scientists and engineers out into the public to talk. We're also doing a lot with blogs. We're trying to use social media, the contemporary available tools for doing this. But it's a big challenge because, in part, you're competing with a lot of noise in the form of stuff that is propaganda, stuff that is wrong, and that, again, is challenging to refute because of this syndrome that so often, if it takes 3 paragraphs to explain why one sentence is wrong, you probably won't get the opportunity to provide them, or if you do, nobody will read them. We're working on it. Yeah, in the middle.
Hi, Dr. Holdren. For this community, science and technology policy researchers, how effective do you think this country is set up to transfer the knowledge that we generate to you and other folks who would make use of it? And what might be able to do to improve it?
Well, one of the syndromes that is challenging about being in the sort of position I'm in is that for a lot of the time you're running on your intellectual capital because you simply don't have time to rejuvenate it. And it is a challenge to stay connected to the community of folks who are continually generating findings and insights that are germane because, again, of the everyday demands of the job. But in fact, the information technologies we've got and the blogosphere and the web and the great search engines are partly compensating for that, partly compensating for the difficulty of the busy schedules that everybody who's actually inside and needs these insights suffer from. I mean, I get a tremendous amount of information across the transom from my colleagues across the field in science and technology policy, across the country and around the world. I get emails every day from folks who say, I think you need to know about this, that we've just developed, we got this report out, and I do find time to read those. And I know the other folks in my office do, and we compile and share among us lists of the best recent stuff that is coming in. And we also reach out actively. That is, the only way you can do the job that I'm supposed to do. I have a staff of almost 100 in OSTP, and it pales in comparison to the breadth of the issues and our need to be on top of all of them, to be prepared to advise the president on any given one. And we get a bunch of tornadoes across the country, and the president wants to know everything we know about tornadoes. And are they or are they not connected to global climate change in terms of the intensity and the frequency? We have a nuclear reactor accident in Japan. The president needs to know right away everything that's relevant. I've written the president 5 memos about Fukushima and what we're learning from it and what the situation is about. I've met with him multiple times on that issue alone. With 100 people, you can't keep track of the domain that we need to keep track of. PCAST helps us with that. That's another 20 folks. But most importantly are the networks that everybody has out into your community and other communities like yours across the country and even around the world. We reach out. When I need to know something that nobody in OSTP knows, and I call up Secretary Chu and he finds out that nobody in DOE knows, I reach out to my friends and colleagues in academia around the country. And one of the wonderful things about my job is that everybody takes my call. That in the whole science and engineering community, people are eager to help. They want their knowledge, their insights to be relevant. And so they all take the call. And if I say, you know, the president wants to know by tomorrow morning everything we know about this esoteric subject that I don't know enough about, folks will stay up all night providing it out there in the community. And we ask them for that, and they do it without complaint. So I think that part is actually working pretty well. Let's see, yes.
Hi, it's clear that the president understands the importance of reaching out to traditionally underrepresented groups in science and technology, engineering and math, and with establishing the White House Council on Girls, etc. And I'm curious what OSTP is doing to broaden the participation of these groups, and if there's an opportunity there to make sure that we're not leaving half of our country behind.
Right. No, we are very much aware of that, and we participate very energetically in these administration-wide and White House-wide efforts to engage and reach out to underrepresented groups, not just women, but a wide variety of groups that are not well represented in science, technology, and engineering. We've been involved in helping to identify as mentors successful and distinguished women in science and engineering, which OSTP knows about because of our networks of the sort that I've just been talking about. And we've brought them to town and got them together with large groups of kids. I mean, one of the most important things I've alluded to several times already is the existence proof of putting in front of kids a successful woman, a successful African American woman, for example, a successful minority of some other type, so that the kids get a real life demonstration of, again, the exciting careers that are available to them if they focus. I remember an extraordinary event in October of 2009 was an event we called Astronomy Night for Kids on the White House lawn. And we had about 300 kids from middle schools in the Washington area, a very large proportion of them African American, at least half of them girls, 4 or 5 per school from every middle school in the area. And we had 16 telescopes, each one with a NASA astronomer or a American Museum of Natural History astronomer explaining what the telescope was pointed at, what the kids could see through it. The diversity of that group of astronomers was deliberately very high. I think it was at least half women. We had 5 astronauts. We had Sally Ride, the first American woman in space. We had Mae Jemison, the first African American woman in space. We had John Grunsfeld, the Hubble repairman. We had Buzz Aldrin, the second person to set foot on the moon. And we had, of course, Charlie Bolden, the NASA administrator, African-American, 4-time astronaut, Marine test pilot, amazing character. And we had these 300 kids, and the president comes out, and the president made some remarks before the kids were all turned loose with these astronauts and these displays and these telescopes. President, First Lady, had the first daughters there as well. And there were 2 kids, a boy and a girl, each 15 years old, each of whom had made, at the age of 14, a year before, a major astronomical discovery. The girl had discovered a new supernova, the boy had discovered an anomalous pulsar. The president had met with them and their families, and he comes out with these 2 kids, and he starts talking to the 300 assembled about what these 2 kids had achieved. And then he says to the group, he says, think about the discoveries that are out there waiting for you to make if you focus in your schoolwork, if you stay in school, if you study math and science, and if you reach for the stars. My wife was in that group out in the audience mingling with the students, and she said half those kids had tears running down their faces because they said, one of them turned to the kid next to her and said, the president was talking to me. I mean, these kinds of events, in my judgment, really matter. Reaching out to girls, to kids, to African Americans and other minorities with role models, with people who have done it and succeeded, and examples. There's nothing like it. I don't think any of those kids will ever be the same. And that's the way we're trying to get it done. I think that we should probably call it to a close at that point. I suspect we're way over time.
If there are 1 or 2
okay, we can take it up. I want to get somebody way in the back. Yes. I see a waving microphone way in the back.
Yes,
We'll
thank you.
take a few more.
Thanks for talking to us. You were talking about cooperation and communication of findings, and I was interested in knowing what your thoughts were about the NIH public access policy. It's whether you think it's successful and whether it would be extended to other federally funded research.
Yeah, we are talking about that. There's a very interesting set of tensions. I was asked to comment on it in my testimony today before the Appropriations Subcommittee. The tensions are, on the one hand, between intellectual property and priority, and in some cases, classified information. That doesn't particularly apply to NIH, but it applies in some other cases. And on the other hand, the enormous benefits of access and openness and more rapid sharing of information. And I think this administration very clearly, in that balance, is leaning toward the openness, toward the access, very interested in expanding the NIH model to other federally funded research. And I think you'll see that happen.
If I just may, I wrote a thesis on it, so if you're trying to prove that it's legal, let me know.
You should write me an email. My email address is real easy. It's jholdren, all one word, no caps, not case sensitive, at OSTP, as in Office of Science and Technology Policy, .EOP, Executive Office of the President, .gov. I read my email. I get 500 a day, but I read them.
First and foremost, I wanted to thank you for your continued support of the nanotechnology signature initiatives. The administration has really done a lot on that front, especially in nanoelectronics. But my question relates to the international collaboration aspect of your presentation, and especially given the nature of this meeting. You mentioned the strategic economic dialogue, and my question to you is, what are some of the practical takeaways that we hope to achieve with China in the strategic economic dialogue, in the innovation dialogue as well, and how can the private sector be helpful in that discussion?
Okay, let me start with the innovation dialogue, which is a part of the strategic and economic dialogue, which I co-chair with Minister Wang Gong, the Science and Technology Minister of China. That dialogue is focused on best practices in innovation policy, comparative innovation policy between the two countries, but the real focus of it from our side is to try to persuade the Chinese that the discriminatory aspects of their indigenous innovation policy are not helpful to them. They're not merely discriminatory and harmful in terms of access of American and other non-Chinese businesses to the Chinese marketplace, but they're actually inhibiting the pace of innovation in China for a wide variety of reasons, and that's what we've been talking about. And we've actually gotten the Chinese to back away from the most discriminatory aspects of their policies, and President Hu, in his state visit here in January, announced that they were renouncing those parts of their policy. In the innovation dialogue, by the way, we have major participation from private companies on the US side and on the Chinese side. And that's been extremely helpful in developing understanding among the government officials of how innovation really works on the ground and in the private sector. I think we're particularly fortunate that Minister Wang Gong himself spent 15 years in Germany and rose to become the director of research at Audi before he returned to China. So this is an individual, an engineer, who really knows something about how innovation works in the West and has been, I would say, unusually receptive to the proposition that really thinking about how innovation works and not just how you can benefit temporarily from excluding access of foreign firms is going to work out in the long run. And we'll be talking about that at the Strategic and Economic Dialogue meetings that are coming up immediately.
Okay, at this point, I think we will stop. Thank you, John.
Thank you.